Your last name might belong to the only native nation that never signed a treaty of surrender. The Seminole fought the United States 3 times, vanished into swamps no army could hold, and still call themselves Unconquered. Here is what almost no one tells you. The Seminole surnames carried in Florida today are not the Scottish trader names you find among the other tribes. They are rarer. Some come from war chiefs the army hunted for decades. Some come from clans passed down through Seminole mothers. And the final name belonged to a man whose descendants still lead the tribe. Before we start, one fact changes how you hear every name that follows. The Seminole were not an ancient tribe. They were a nation forged in resistance, formed in the 1700s and 1800s, when Creek people, especially Red Stick refugees fleeing the Creek War, moved south into Spanish Florida and merged with other peoples already there. The name itself is often traced to a word meaning runaway or wild, the people who broke away. And like the Creek they came from, they were matrilineal. Your clan, your identity, your belonging came through your mother. That is why Seminole surnames work so differently from the others. Many are not inherited European family names at all. They are clan names, war names, and mother's line names carried into the modern era. Here are 10 of them. Number 10. Tiger. It sounds like a nickname, but it is one of the most important Seminole surnames alive today, and it runs directly through the mother's line. Betty Mae Tiger Jumper was born in a Seminole camp near Indiantown, Florida, the daughter of Ada Tiger of the Snake Clan, and under the Seminole matrilineal system, she carried her mother's name. She became the first Seminole to graduate high school, a trained nurse, the founder of the tribe's newspaper, and in 1967 the first woman ever elected to chair the Seminole Tribe of Florida. The Tiger name also runs back to Thlaklo Tustanugee, called Tiger Tail, a war leader who fought in the Second Seminole War rather than surrender. That is the twist with this name. It is not a surname handed down from a father, it is a clan name carried by Seminole mothers, and it sits at the very center of the modern tribe. It is worth pausing on how strict that matrilineal world was. The Florida Seminoles so fiercely guarded their bloodline through the mother that intermarriage with outsiders was discouraged to an extreme degree, and clan identity was everything. A name like Tiger is not a label. It is a clan carried forward by women, generation after generation. If Tiger is in your family, your line may run straight through the matrilineal heart of the Seminole Nation. The next name belonged to a family that turned resistance into leadership. Number 9. Jumper. English on the surface, but among the Seminole it belongs to a line of principal chiefs and modern leaders. In the removal era, John Jumper became a principal chief of the Seminole in Indian Territory, and after him, his brother led the nation through the upheaval of the Civil War years. The name carried into the 20th century through Betty Mae Tiger Jumper, whose married name joined 2 of the great Seminole family lines. That is what these names do. They interweave, clan into clan, leadership family into leadership family, across generations. The Jumper name marks a lineage that held the office of chief in the West and helped carry the nation through its hardest political passages. And the split matters here, because there are 2 Seminole nations today, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, descended from those removed west, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida, descended from the few hundred who never left. The Jumper name reaches into the Oklahoma leadership line and the Florida story alike. If Jumper is your name, your line may reach into the ruling families of the Seminole Nation in Indian Territory. The next name belonged to the most famous Seminole who ever lived. Number 8. Osceola. This is not a European surname at all, and it belongs to the single most famous Seminole in history. Osceola, from the Creek Ossi Yahola, combining the sacred black drink, Ossi, with Yahola. The ceremonial shout was born around 1804 to a Creek mother, raised in the Creek matrilineal tradition, and migrated to Florida as a child with Red Stick refugees. He was not a hereditary chief. He rose entirely on skill, fury, and will, and he became the face of Seminole resistance in the Second Seminole War, outmaneuvering 5 United States generals. His end is one of the great betrayals of American history. He was captured in 1837 under a flag of truce, imprisoned, and died a few months later at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. That is the weight this name carries. After he died, Army doctors did something that still shocks people who hear it. The physician who attended him removed and kept his head. That is how badly the man haunted his captors. Even in death, they could not simply let him rest. And yet his name outlived every one of them. If Osceola is in your family, your line may connect to the most storied name in Seminole history. The next name belonged to a chief who chose survival. Number 7. Micanopy, a Seminole name, and it belonged to the highest hereditary chief of the nation during the Second Seminole War. Micanopy, the name, means something like head chief or governor, inherited his position through the Alachua chiefly line, succeeding through the maternal succession that governed Seminole leadership. He was the principal chief when war broke out, a wealthy man who owned cattle and, like some Seminole leaders, held Black Seminoles in a form of bondage far looser than Southern slavery. When resistance became impossible, Micanopy made the hard choice. He led his people west to Indian Territory and spent his final years fighting to win the Seminole a separate nation, free of Creek control. That is the twist. The hereditary chief is not remembered as the great warrior that was Osceola and Wildcat, but he carried the harder burden of deciding when survival mattered more than resistance. The maternal succession is the key to understanding him. Micanopy inherited his position not from a father but through his mother's line, succeeding his great-uncle's line, the way Seminole power always passed sideways and downward through the women of the ruling clan, never simply from father to son. If a name from this Alachua chiefly line runs in your family, it reaches into the oldest hereditary leadership of the Seminole. The next name belonged to the warrior who escaped everything. Number 6. Coacoochee Wildcat, a Seminole war name belonging to one of the most brilliant tactical leaders of the entire Seminole resistance. Coacoochee, known to Americans as Wildcat, was a frontline commander in the Second Seminole War, famous for a legendary escape from imprisonment at Fort Marion, slipping out through a high, narrow window when the army thought him securely caged. He fought, negotiated, was captured, and kept going. Removed west to Indian Territory, he refused to settle for a diminished life. There he led a band of Seminoles and Black Seminoles all the way to Mexico, where they were granted land in exchange for guarding the border, and where he died of smallpox in 1857. That is the astonishing arc of this name. Florida swamp, Army prison, Indian Territory, and finally Mexico, a leader who crossed an entire continent rather than be contained. There are Seminole descendants in Mexico to this day, the Muskogos, descendants of the Black Seminoles who followed leaders like Wildcat across the border and never came back. A single resistance leader seeded communities in 3 countries. If a name from Wildcat's line runs in your family, it carries one of the most unbreakable resistance stories in Native history. The next name belonged to the last chief to lay down arms. Number 5. Bowlegs, an English rendering of a Seminole chiefly line, and it belonged to the leaders who fought to the very end. The name traces back through Bowleg, anglicized as Bowlegs of the Alachua chiefly line, and it reached its most famous bearer in Holotamico, called Billie Bowlegs, who led the Seminole through the Third Seminole War in the 1850s, the last of the Seminole Wars. He held out in the Florida wilderness long after most had been removed, and when he finally agreed to go west in 1858, it marked the end of organized armed Seminole resistance. But even then, the name did not vanish from Florida. Billie Bowlegs III became a famous hunter, guide, and keeper of Seminole history well into the 20th century. That is the endurance in this name. It belonged to the last war chief to leave Florida, and to the storyteller who made sure the world remembered. By the end of the Third Seminole War, the entire Seminole population, still hiding in Florida, had been reduced to only a few hundred people, the ancestors of nearly every Florida Seminole alive today. A whole modern nation descends from that tiny, unconquered remnant. If Bowlegs is your name, your line may reach into the last stand of the Seminole in their homeland. The next name belonged to the people history almost erased. Number 4. Bruner. Now the story opens into a part of Seminole history most people have never heard. Bruner is one of the great Black Seminole surnames carried by the descendants of the African people who allied with, lived among, and fought beside the Seminole. Caesar Bruner led one of the recognized freedmen bands of the Seminole Nation, and the Bruner name appears on the Dawes rolls among the Seminole freedmen. The Black Seminoles were not a footnote. They were warriors and interpreters whose stake in the fight was existential, because removal or defeat could mean re-enslavement. They fought so fiercely in the Second Seminole War that the conflict has been called the largest slave rebellion in American history. That is the revelation buried in this name. The Seminole resistance was not only native, it was a native and Black alliance forged in the swamps of Florida, and names like Bruner carry that shared history. And that alliance came at a terrible cost later. The Black Seminoles and their descendants would spend generations fighting for recognition and citizenship within the Seminole Nation a struggle over the freedmen rolls that continues in the courts even now. Names like Bruner carry both the pride of the alliance and the weight of that long fight. If Bruner is in your family, your line may reach into one of the most remarkable alliances in American history. The next name belonged to a modern dynasty of chiefs. Number 3. Osceola again, but now the modern tribe alongside the name Cypress. Here is where the story comes into the present. When the United States tried to terminate the Seminole Tribe of Florida in the 20th century, a handful of families organized to save it. Bill Osceola helped raise money by creating a rodeo. Billie Osceola became the first elected chairman in 1957, and the Cypress name rose alongside them. Billie Cypress became the first Seminole to earn a college degree, and Mitchell Cypress served for years as a chairman and leader of the tribe. These names, Osceola, Cypress, Tommy, Billie, are the names of the families who took a people the federal government had openly wanted to dissolve and terminate, and built it instead into one of the most economically powerful tribes in all of America. That is the twist. The same surnames that appear in the war records of the 1800s appear again in the boardrooms and council chambers of the modern Seminole tribe. The Cypress name in particular runs deep into the Big Cypress country the tribe is named for, some of the most remote wetland in Florida, where Seminole families held out longest and kept the old language and ways alive into the modern age. If Cypress or Osceola is your name, your line may run from the swamps of the Seminole Wars straight into the leadership of the nation today. The next name belonged to the medicine and the mothers. Number 2. Billie, one of the most common and important Seminole surnames alive, and it carries the traditional soul of the tribe. Susie Jim Billie, born around 1900, lived past 100, and was a revered maker of traditional medicine and a grand matriarch of the Panther clan. And James Billie Chief, Jim Billie, chaired the Seminole Tribe of Florida for more than 2 decades, one of the longest-serving elected leaders in the entire Western Hemisphere, the man who launched the high-stakes gaming operations that transformed the tribe's fortunes and changed Indian gaming across the whole country. That is the range this single name holds. On one side, a Panther clan matriarch, keeping the old medicine alive in a chickee in the Everglades. On the other, a chairman who took the Seminole into a United States Supreme Court case and built an economic empire, tradition and power, carried in one surname. The gaming empire Jim Billie helped build is not a small footnote either. It grew into an economic force so large that the Seminole Tribe of Florida eventually purchased the entire Hard Rock brand, hotels, casinos, and guitars, worldwide. A people the government once tried to dissolve came to own one of the most recognizable brands on earth. If Billie is your name, your line may reach into both the spiritual and the political heart of the modern Seminole. And now we come to the final name, the one that ties the entire story together. Number 1. Osceola, the bloodline that would not be captured. We return to it because no name captures the Seminole story more completely. The man Osceola was betrayed under a flag of truce and died in a prison cell far from Florida in 1838, but his line and his name refused to die with him. His great-great-great-grandson, Joe Dan Osceola, became the first Florida Seminole to graduate high school and college, a chief and ambassador of the tribe, and a founder of Seminole institutions in the 20th century. Bill Osceola built the rodeo that saved the tribe from termination. Billie Osceola became its first elected chairman, and Marcellus Osceola Jr. leads the Seminole Tribe of Florida today. Think about what that means. The United States captured the man, imprisoned him, and buried him in South Carolina. And nearly 2 centuries later, the Osceola name still sits at the head of the Seminole Nation, in a Florida the tribe never fully left. That is the final revelation of this list. The Seminole called themselves the Unconquered, and they meant it literally: no treaty of surrender, no final defeat, a continuous line of resistance and leadership from the swamps of the 1800s to the council chamber today. Osceola, Tiger, Billie, Cypress, Bowlegs. Every one of them a thread in a nation that was never truly beaten. So look at these names again, the war names and the clan names, the chiefs and the matriarchs and the Black Seminole allies, the fighters who slipped every trap the army set, because together they tell you something no other native story quite does. The Seminole did not just survive removal. A part of the nation never left Florida at all. They melted into the Everglades, held out through 3 wars, and their descendants govern a thriving nation there today. A name that came from a war chief. A name that came from a Seminole mother's clan. A name that came from an alliance forged in the swamps. If your family carries one of these Osceola, Tiger, Billie, Jumper, Bowlegs, any of them, do not assume you already know its story. Behind an ordinary surname, there may be a Seminole mother, a clan, a war chief, and a place in the story of the only people who never signed away their freedom. Tell me in the comments which of these names is yours, and where your family traces back to the reservation, the band, the clan, the story you grew up hearing. And subscribe, because there is another nation, another set of surnames, and another buried history waiting to be decoded, and next time, the name on the mailbox might be yours.